Hello, everybody. Hope everyone's having a good afternoon so far. My talk is a little bit different from the ones you've previously heard, but it's an honor to be here. As a photographer, it's sometimes a little bit nerve-wracking or difficult even to be up here on the stage because I strive so hard to remain invisible, as difficult as that is, while I'm taking pictures of people. I would rather the images speak for themselves and to allow the people in them to be represented the way they wish to be. But I also want to be a bridge between the people in the photographs and to you, the audience, who will hopefully see these pictures and learn something or gain some knowledge about the situations. I'm a freelance photographer, and I primarily cover the Middle East. I've been taking pictures since I was 15 years old. I was self-taught, so I had to forge a pretty progressive path into photography. And history, which was one of my main interests as a kid, was a big propellant for that. Images from the Vietnam War and the Second World War, as well as the wars that were going on the time I was a teenager in Afghanistan and Iraq, were extremely influential to me, even though I didn't intend to become a conflict photographer. I felt that photography was my vehicle for interpreting the world, and I hoped to witness historical events. I always thought that that would be such an amazing way to experience the world. And sort of onto the first story that I'm going to show you. I was already freelancing. I was doing some local assignments in New York and elsewhere in Europe before I went to Libya in 2011. But Libya was where I really started working on international coverage and stories. And it all sort of started with the Arab Spring that started in the beginning of 2011. I bought a ticket to Egypt without an assignment. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew that I wanted to go and cover the protests there. So I landed, I went to Tahrir Square, I met with some other fellow photojournalists and just started photographing the protests there. And from there, the protests in Libya had started, so I knew I wanted to move on to the next thing, and I maybe naively took a train and then a minibus to the border right next to Egypt and showed up there without so much as a plan to, with any idea of what I was going to do next. But I was very lucky. I met a lot of people who were very willing to help me there. Libya before 2011 was ruled by a brutal dictator. His name was Muammar Gaddafi, and he'd seized power in 1969 and became this iron-fisted madman, killing and disappearing many of his opponents. He destroyed free civil society as well as the country's institutions. And for 40 years, people lived under this dictatorship. But for the first time ever, in 2011, people were free to criticize. And it was something so pivotal and so historic that I think it's something very difficult for many of us to imagine because we've never had our liberties so severely restricted. I arrived in Benghazi, which was the eastern city that had thrown off government control. And shortly after I got there, I had witnessed this mass public prayer that was happening on Friday. And people were experiencing freedom for the first time. They were all in the streets protesting and criticizing Gaddafi as freely as they wished. And at this point, it was also very sobering for me. It was the first time I really encountered situations like this, but also I could feel the oppression of people being lifted. But very quickly, the war replaced their joy with anguish. This photograph in particular was of a funeral for a protester who had been shot a few days earlier, and he had died of his wounds. I also spent a great deal of time on the front lines, perhaps too much time, because I thought that originally was where the story was. And in many ways it was. While trying to grapple with the concept of war, people who had never been fighters were changed to fighters overnight, and they experienced a very violent kind of trauma in that process. Many people were regular civilians, teachers, pharmacists, restaurant owners, and students before this revolution started. And often in the fog of war, innocent people are also targeted. And this was such the case when migrant workers who were accused of being mercenaries for the Gaddafi forces were wrongly imprisoned. But yet all the institutions that would normally exist in a democratic government were not there to begin with. So the Libyans overnight felt that they were left alone to try to build a new state from nothing. I think for the first time here, I also recognized and realized what conflict does to a society and to its people. Not only is it a matter of seeing death, these bodies here were actually loyalist forces loyal to the government that were left in a makeshift morgue before they were buried. So not only is it a matter of seeing death, but it's also trying to engage and also to tell the stories of the people who are left behind. It was a very chaotic and confusing situation at many points of the 11 months I was in Libya. And I certainly didn't understand the full risks or consequences of everything that was going on at the time. And yet, when I see these photographs, when I look back on my time in Libya, there were also instances in which things just seem so completely bizarre or out of place. Like, this fighter, he's laughing while he's running away from sniper fire, holding an RPG. And beneath his feet is a sea of shell casings from all the fire and all the bullets that the rebels were shooting. This was an alleged government soldier who was captured by the rebels towards the end of the war. He's haggard, he hasn't had a shower in weeks probably, and he's being taunted by the rebel fighters. And from this I learned that war is never really black and white, in the sense that neither side can ever remain truly good to their cause, because they have each felt that they've been so wronged. Front lines are often very difficult to cover, of course, whether it's an urban environment or not. You're always at the mercy of snipers or random incoming fire, and so all you can do is wait. And when I was waiting, this rebel leader had poked his head around the corner and was shot. And this was one of the final results of the battle near where Gaddafi was eventually captured and killed. And what I took away from this experience is that wars never really end. So many consequences continue to seize the country today, and in countries that have experienced conflict or are undergoing conflict. The aftermath is often a lot more bloody than the war itself. But when I started covering Syria, a very different situation resulted. These photos are in this slideshow are from both Iraq and Syria. I started covering Syria in 2012 and started covering the offensive for Mosul last year in Iraq. They are the more loud, perhaps horrific photos that we most associate with war. But it is true to the reality of the nature of conflict. I focused mainly on the most vulnerable people, which were the civilians. And yet, even in Iraq and Syria, even though they're both very different conflicts, their effects are the same. They have, it creates devastating loss and generations of children who have missed school and their childhoods. War creates a disintegration of normal life, and violence becomes normalized. The reality of a war and the slow descent into madness. I won't go into too much detail about the actual photos themselves, but I wanted to use them to illustrate what we can and what we do see from war, and compare them to a few stories that I'll show you later on, which are a bit quieter. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about how we consume images today. Images today are how we use them, how we see them, how we identify with them are more relevant perhaps than ever before. And in a way, it can also seem like the pictures, because there are so many of these images, or even on social media, the impact of them can be lessened. Our visual language has evolved to the point where taking and sharing pictures has become second nature to us. We often share selfies, pictures of our meals, of our holidays, our families, and sharing them so publicly in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do so before the advent of the phone camera. But I also think that, when we look at the pictures of photojournalism, how does that all fit into this very broad category of photography? Something like 1.8 billion pictures are uploaded every single day onto websites and social media platforms. So with this constant stream of imagery, how and is photojournalism or photography still vital to our understanding of the world? Am I, as a photojournalist, different from a citizen journalist, for example, or an average person with their cell phone camera? Probably not. On the surface, there are really no differences. The camera is really just a tool. But it goes beyond that when photojournalists have to verify facts. They have to know what to do with the information they've gathered. And when I sit down to edit my pictures, I also have to remember the ethical guidelines that I have to stick by. And so when I sit down and edit pictures, I might be able to take out sensor dust or something, but I cannot remove anything else. And that's where it really stops. But on the other hand, technology has helped us as photographers so much. I use Lightroom to very quickly edit and file photographs. And I think exciting new technologies like VR, virtual reality, and 360 videos can really help advance the work that we do as photojournalists to help engage the audiences and public with the work that we do. And so I do think that photojournalism is still very important and vital to our deeper understanding of the world today. I think that it's also perhaps because, or even with the democratization of technology, we still need accuracy and truthfulness. I'm going to move on to two stories here, which are very different from the images that were looping earlier. This is one that's a little bit quieter. It isn't really one of the explosions or the grief, but something that eats away at a society no less. It's about the psychological toll that can often be invisible, but also it's about the resilience of people and how, despite the most horrific things we can imagine happening to them, there is still a will to survive. I hope for this to be a different perspective on war that we might be used to seeing. This first story, it's from Syria. It's not so much about the obvious physical destruction, but it's another side of the toll of conflict, and that was of electricity, and how people must adapt their lives without it. Aleppo was one of the largest cities in Syria before the war, with a population of over 2 million people. Across the country since the start of the war in 2012, satellite images have shown that over 85% of the lights have gone out over the country. Most people actually lived pretty comfortable middle-class lives before the war. People had smartphones, they went to universities, they vacationed elsewhere, and Syria had a very wonderfully rich culture and even nightlife scene in Damascus. So imagine life without electricity. We're so used to flipping the switch on at home, turning on the heater, air conditioning. In Syria, the war's psychological toll is not only the immediate trauma of violent conflict, but is also the story of the grinding effect on daily life and function. In this image, you can see the body of a Syrian government soldier who was allegedly killed in the fighting, and his body was dumped in an opposition neighborhood with no plans for burial. So random people went up to his body and was trying to identify him, and one man in particular used his cell phone flashlight to look at his face. Even at night, the shelling continued, and the illumination of this particular rocket made it so much starker against the night sky. Only you can see that in some of the photographs, some of the apartments have lights on, and these were actually the apartments lucky enough to have had bought a generator and enough money to buy the fuel to power them. I wanted to add a note on the timing of these pictures too. Most of these photographs were taken between 7:30 p.m. and just after midnight. These were supposed to be times when homes and also the streets would have been at their liveliest. And with these images and also the people in them, I tried to capture a sense of place, its eeriness without lights, even though there were still many people who were living in the city at this stage of the war in 2013. This was a coffee shop in the middle of one of what was the most busy neighborhoods in Aleppo. And then around the corner was an Islamist fighter reading the Quran with a flashlight. At the time these pictures were taken, it was still somewhat possible to work in Syria, even though kidnappings of foreign journalists were on the rise. I was taken around by some of the Syrian students who guided me there. We drove around in darkness looking for places that could represent the dire lack of electricity in opposition neighborhoods. And of course, I still had to have a light source to be able to take the pictures, so I used a tripod and slow shutter speed, and also, of course, there was some illumination on some of the photographs here. We also managed to get up high, despite the danger of snipers as well, to see the disparity between the opposition neighborhoods in the foreground, it's very dark, and the government-controlled neighborhoods on the horizon, which is completely lit up. For many months, and because of the fighting, electricity was cut to the opposition neighborhoods. Like all commodities, electricity was used against opponents on all sides. And this is what much of Syria looks like now. It's deserted, in many cases damaged beyond repair. The loss of human life is irreparable, and electricity poles like the trees are stripped bare. Tank tracks cover the ripped cement. And on to the next story. This is from Iraq, and it's a very different story. It's a much more human story, but it is also about the consequences of conflict. It's about the consequences of ISIS's rise in the region. I also wanted to highlight that this story was about hope and resilience. It's a story on Yazidi women trying to take back control over their lives and their bodies by being trained and prepared to fight against ISIS if need be. In August of 2014, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria launched an attack on the Yazidi population in northern Iraq. Before 2014, there was an estimated 500,000 Yazidi people, but during the 2014 siege, about 5,000 people were massacred, and the same number were captured and enslaved. Most of them were women, and some of them were children. Figures vary widely. It's believed that there's up to 3,000 people, mostly women and some children, who are still being held in captivity today. Yazidis, for those of you who may not know, is one of Iraq's oldest religious minorities, and they were previously very isolated from the other Arab communities around them. So an image of a Yazidi woman in military uniform would have previously been very unthinkable. But after many of them were released from captivity and after they realized that they had to fight back, hundreds did enlist and joined one battalion. And I followed this battalion over a period of few days. Many of the women came from very impoverished families, and several of these women had been previously captured by ISIS and managed to escape their brutal captivity. Some of them had been sold as brides multiple times and raped by their husbands. The will and the courage of some of these women to fight back and reclaim their lives and honor again, I thought was really remarkable. And my understanding of what motivated them to fight back really became clear when I met this woman. She was 29, she had just been rescued a few days before I took this photograph, which is why I concealed her identity. She was captured with her 2 youngest children and was forced to marry an ISIS fighter who repeatedly raped her. In many cases, the women and girls as young as 10 are being sold online in these forums between the ISIS fighters, with virgin girls fetching higher prices. ISIS's ideology was not only about cleansing the population, it was about subjecting and enslaving a religious minority. Yazidism is widely misunderstood still, even within Iraq. This is a place called Lalish, which is their holiest site in the religion. It's a religion that's derived from various other religions, actually. It even draws from Sunni Islam, but its main source is from Zoroastrianism and pre-Islamic Mesopotamian religious traditions. As a foreign journalist there, I was welcomed very warmly and very openly by many, even by the people who have suffered a great deal of discrimination. They continue their rituals there, such as baptizing their children, and despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people remain in displaced persons camps, they continue their religious traditions. In a way, it's a kind of defiance against their oppressors. And in documenting this story, I hope to show another side of Yazidis, which is rarely seen. It's about the defiance in the form of continued religious rituals and the creation of an all-female military unit trained to defend their people and their own communities. And again, such an all-female force would have previously been unthinkable, given the conservatism and isolation of the Yazidis. It's also a look into the existential struggle to remain attached to their land and culture, even as the security of their ancestral homes is in doubt. And it's about the determination to reestablish their rights as one of Iraq's oldest religious minorities. And finally, got a funny photo, just to change the topic a little bit. I've been asked a lot, whether I use specific terms to categorize myself in photojournalism. I've been asked if I like to be called a war photographer. I don't. War photography, I feel like that term can somewhat trivialize the story or the people in the pictures. People who have given me their time and shared their stories with me. And the term can also often romanticize what photographers do, and it's almost always very far from romantic. Sleeping on dirty, smelly mattresses, eating canned tuna for weeks on end. I also make a mental list of the top 10 worst toilet experiences, and it includes accounting for the fear factor of either the size of the spiders I'm going to encounter in the outhouse or the likelihood of being bombed off the toilet while doing your morning business. Strange but true thoughts that are nevertheless very real in the field. I've also, as you can see, found myself on various modes of transportation. It's part of the adventure, but also the pain of logistics, as is finding internet in spotty connected places and figuring out how to file pictures from rooftops to basements to open fields. And then sometimes the situation looks like this for me, where I'm crowded into, or corralled really, into a group of other photographers. In this situation, we were all in Libya. Almost all of us did not want to be corralled together. I respect these photographers in this picture very much. We were watching a newly minted rebel fire some rockets. And one of them is also wearing a tampon in her ear because nobody thought of bringing earplugs that day. That's the nature of what we do. And this is a kind of a dual photograph where one was a colleague who took care of me when I first came under fire, and another was a rebel but guided us through some pretty dangerous situations in Libya. And I really owe a lot to the people who've taken me under their wing, and also to the local people that we as journalists work with, and we often put our lives in their hands, and they risk a lot for us, and often they have to stay while we are able to leave. So all of these factors is what goes into behind the scenes of taking pictures. So why do we do this? A close friend and one of the best people I've ever known, James Foley, said it best. After he was released from his first kidnapping in Libya in 2011, he did an interview in which he was asked, why? Why do it? And Jim said, there is physical courage, but that's nothing compared to moral courage. If I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism. And beyond that, and in my interpretation, I think he was trying to say that we, as people, have a responsibility to each other. I understand the world through images, and that's how I hope to bridge what people are experiencing from one side of the world to the people who are seeing it on another side. And to be a bridge for the common themes that we all share in our collective humanity. So thank you so much.